Marketing Dividends, presented by the Australian Association of National Advertisers, inspiring responsible, innovative and respected marketing.
Well, today on Marketing Dividends, we're going to take a look at the business challenges facing Australia's leading advertisers. Joining me at the desk, as he does each time, James Hire, CEO of MEC, and today's guest, Adam Morgan, founder of international strategic brand consultancy Eat Big Fish and author of A Beautiful Constraint, How to Transform Your Limitations into Advantages. James, as always, great to have you on board. And look, thanks very much for joining us today, Adam. I might start and just about the book, Eating the Big Fish in 1999, very much about challenger brands taking on brand leaders. Fast forward to where we are now. Has there been much of a change in, I suppose, the notion of challenger brands?
Yeah, I think three big shifts, really. First, obviously, is that the book was written on the cusp of the digital revolution, and the world's changed a little bit. And theoretically, it's now much easier for a challenger to find and engage with its consumers, so that's obviously a big change, although the reality is that world is full of just as much dross and mediocrity as the previous one was. The second thing is that actually I think people recognise that being a challenger now is much more about what you're challenging rather than who you're challenging. So in 1999, it was more about Adidas versus Nike, or about Virgin versus British Airways, whereas now the modern generation of challengers are challenging something about the category. So think of Airbnb challenging the conventions of the hospitality business, or Spotify challenging the notion that we need to own music at all to enjoy it, for instance, or indeed, you know, the culture that surrounds it. So think of Dove taking on the beauty myth. So I think that's the second big shift. And the third and final one is probably that actually people recognise it's much more about a mindset than a state of market. So you look at Tim Rosa, who's the CMO of Fitbit. He says very openly, we've got a large chunk of this category as Fitbit, but I encourage all of my people to have that challenger mindset, because that's what keeps us fresh, finding new opportunities, questioning assumptions, staying ahead of the game.
You talk about Spotify and Airbnb and the same notion of a challenger brand, but these are billion-dollar brands. They're not the plucky upstart that we've been used to. Now, they are disrupting the markets and they are challenging conventions. Are they changing what we think of as the notion of a challenger brand?
I think they have had a huge kind of effect in terms of gravitational pull. So in 1999, if you ask clients who they wanted to be, they would say, I want to be the Virgin of this category. By that, they meant, I want the image disruption that Virgin brings to any category it goes to. If you ask clients now, they say, I want to be the Uber of this category. They want the product disruption that Uber brings. So that is a shift. At the same time, both of those things really add up to a kind of a progression or a disruption of relationship. So I think they're adding up to the same thing. It's just that the ways of getting there have changed.
So is it cool to be the challenger?
I think it's very cool to be the challenger. Not in every category. So I think there are some markets where actually they want to the status of being a market leader, but there are lots of countries around the world where culturally being the underdog or rooting for the underdog is a good thing.
Since Eat Big Fish has come out in 1999, obviously some of the challenger brands have gone out of business. I think one of the famous ones, Goldfish, a UK financial brand, is no longer around. Is there something about the change in behaviour or how they go to market that leads to the demise of a challenger brand?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the key things that a challenger needs to understand is that you need to change to stay the same. So let's look at Goldfish as an example. Goldfish is born in a context which is all about big, grey, monolithic financial service companies with no empathy with their consumer at all. Suddenly, this fun, friendly little company launches a credit card with a goldfish on the front, calls itself Goldfish, for heaven's sake, allows you to choose one of 3 different kinds of goldfish that you can have on your card, so we all share it with our friends and see what we've got. That seems very fresh and different. Once you've done it and everybody else piles in with their own little friendly financial services company called Smile or Egg or whatever it's called, suddenly it's no longer different anymore. Suddenly everybody is fun and friendly. That's the new code of the category. So simply staying where you are means you just get in the middle of the road and you get run over. You've got to keep changing to stay the same.
That's the difficulty, isn't it? That's the big challenge, and it goes back to what you were saying before about the head guy at Fitbit trying to challenge his staff to maintain that sort of that mindset of being the challenger, of being the innovator, I imagine, in the space.
Exactly, which is why it's a state of mind rather than a set of attributes or a set of codes of what you're doing. Yeah.
I think it's an interesting progression because, I mean, you've written a new book, which is A Beautiful Constraint, and that sort of feels counterintuitive. But it's really telling us that problems can be opportunities. And one of the great examples in there is Virgin America launching domestically into the US market against Southwest, an enormous competitor. And what they did was literally turn one of the interior of their aircraft into a catwalk for Victoria's Secret. Is this what you define as a beautiful constraint?
Yeah, this is a great example of taking what should be a disadvantage, in this case a limited marketing budget, and actually making it better than if you'd had that budget in the first place. So basically the situation was they're launching into the US domestic market. They want to put glamour back into the skies. It's a long time since the domestic market in the US has felt glamorous. They have this purple mood lighting in the cabin that makes people feel cool, and if I show it to either of you, you'll want to fly it. The issue is, I don't have the marketing budget to show it to you. So if I can't do that, strategically, what do I have to do? I have to get somebody else to take pictures of it and show it to you for me. So I have to put things in the middle of that cabin that make my passengers, that make the media, show pictures of this mood lighting. What could be more photogenic than Victoria's Secret models? So it was a brilliant way of taking what should have been a limitation and actually turning it into something that made them even cooler, because they're now in this brand neighbourhood of other funky brands doing creative things.
And
Sorry, James.
it wasn't just another publicity stunt. I mean, it's certainly something Virgin was famous for a long time. What makes it different now? It's a beautiful constraint.
I think the difference is it's not just about publicity. You're strategically finding a way to show you the trigger to trial using other people's money. That's a brilliant strategic bit of resourcefulness.
And how difficult is it, and how do you go about broadening organisations' horizons or opening their minds up to that idea, the idea of a beautiful constraint, taking what is essentially viewed as a negative but making it a positive?
Well, I think what's striking is that you're starting to see a lot of organisations do it for themselves. So I was at Reset 2 days ago, the conference, and Brad Jakeman, who's the president of Pepsi's Global Beverages, was saying that although he has billion-dollar brands with very large marketing budgets, the people he is recruiting to work on those are people from tiny little companies that haven't had much budget at all. Why? Because when he puts them in charge of those brands with those budgets, he wants them to think inventively about how they use every single cent, rather than just default to spending on advertising in the way that all their predecessors have done. So they're imposing constraints on themselves. It's a great example of a leader who's thinking progressively about it.
So if a constraint is beautiful, does that mean abundance is ugly? And in fact, overabundance is a huge problem for a company. So if I have too much resource or time or budget, is that actually going to be an impediment to the product I'm developing, the campaign that I'm trying to create? It feels like that's your natural argument.
There's a very famous concept in economics called the resource curse. And the resource curse essentially goes that if you are rich in a natural resource, let's say for the sake of argument oil, while you should theoretically do better than countries without that, in fact the opposite is true. You do worse economically than countries without it. The same is exactly true here, I think. So let's go back to airlines. Let's look at the difference between British Airways and Air New Zealand. British Airways has the resource curse. It has got enough money to spend lavishly on advertising. Air New Zealand doesn't. So what does it do? It uses its safety videos as its primary communication vehicle. That's why they're getting 6 to 7 million pops a time on YouTube, and British Airways isn't. They have to make their constraints beautiful because they don't have the resource curse.
So should we just slice marketing budgets in third, just across the board?
Well, I think it comes at a price. So if you're going to invite people to lean into a constraint, you've got to allow them to question everything else, and you've got to allow them to try things, and they're going to fail at some of those things. So I think you can't, as a finance director, just think, this is fantastic, I'm going to slash and burn everything. It comes at a price for the company. You've got to let them question and explore.
And it feels like the usual suspects to me. I mean, that Pepsi, great marketer, have always been so. Virgin, I'd expect to see called out. You know, your humdrum average corporate that has a culture of not embracing constraints.
Right.
How do you provoke individuals, captains of industry within these companies to actually step out and think a constraint is beautiful?
Well, the first thing you have to get them to recognise is that it's very natural to feel a victim to this constraint. Everybody does. Even if you are brilliant problem-solving junkies who do this 16 times a day, you're always daunted by the constraint that you are faced with because it represents a problem you've never had to solve before. So, of course, that's going to be difficult. What you have to do is 3 things, effectively. First of all, is you need to create a high degree of motivation to get people to lean into it. So that's got to be a personal engagement or some business imperative that makes you want to do it. That creates the persistence and tenacity. Secondly, you have to get them to believe that it's possible by surrounding them with examples of other people that are doing it. And the third is you have to create just enough process and just enough strategy to get them from A to B. And the book is really about laying out 4 or 5 sequential strategies that help them move from one place to another, from victim to transformer, if you like.
Does scale matter at all? Is it as easy to implement that sort of a strategy if you're a small business to a medium-sized business to a large business, or are there constraints along the scale spectrum?
Well, you could look at some of the largest businesses in the world. You look at Google, for instance, and because they come from an engineering background, they understand the importance of constraints, so they will put very small teams together for sprints for very short amounts of time because they believe that those constraints make things better. So it's not about big or small. It goes back to Challenger again. It's about a mindset.
You've been in the market a couple of days now. You've been speaking to local Australian marketers about a beautiful constraint. How are they embracing this? How are they taking it on board?
I was very struck by how enthusiastic and open they are, because Australia famously has never had a downturn, right? You guys are just...
25 years anyway.
Exactly, so it's fantastic. So why would they need to think about this? And actually it does seem to really touch the nerve. I think people are starting to think we can't go on as usual. We've got to do something different. Perhaps even if we're not getting a downturn, we're not getting the growth we want. We're going to have to think more imaginatively and more inventively about it. And the book really is about being inventive, not just innovative. It's about saying don't leave it all to those really smart people in the lab at the end who are coming up with the big innovation. We can all be much more inventive about every aspect of our business, and that's how we're going to grow. And I think that has touched the nerve, I think.
All right. Look, unfortunately, we do have to leave it there, but Adam Morgan, just fascinating stuff. Thanks very much for joining us. And James High, always an absolute pleasure. Thank you. We are going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll get a bit of a wrap on the session so far with Julia Lee from Bell Direct.
Marketing Dividends, presented by the Australian Association of National Advertisers, inspiring responsible, innovative and respected marketing.